Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The crystal flute shattered against the marble floor, the sharp sound swallowed instantly by the heavy velvet drapes, much like the scream trapped in Julian's throat. There was no time to breathe, no time to think, only the sudden, violent shift of gravity as the world tilted and his back collided hard with the cold mahogany of the bookshelf. Books rattled in their casings, dust motes dancing in the singular beam of moonlight cutting through the library gloom, but Julian couldn't look away from the predator looming over him. A hand, calloused and scarred from years of violence, slammed next to his head, boxing him in. The man's other hand gripped Julian's silk lapels, yanking him forward until their noses brushed, a collision of ice and fire. "You think you can play the martyr tonight?" the man growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through Julian's chest, dark and dangerous. "You think you can throw yourself at that vulture out there just to prove a point?" Julian stared up, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was Kalen, his bodyguard, his shadow, the man he was supposed to command, yet who currently looked at him not with deference, but with a terrifying, consuming hunger. To understand how the crown prince of Ethelgard ended up pinned against a wall by his own subordinate, one must understand the cage in which Julian lived. Julian Vane was not a person, he was an asset. As the sole heir to a crumbling monarchy, his life was measured in stock prices, alliances, and public approval ratings. He was 25 years old, possessing the kind of sharp, porcelain beauty that looked good on currency, but inside, he was rotting. His life was orchestrated by his uncle, Lord Regent Silas. Silas was a man of smiles and daggers, a politician who had ruled as regent since Julian's parents died in a tragic aviation accident 10 years prior. Now that Julian was of age, Silas was reluctant to let go of the reins. The latest shackle was a marriage contract. Lady Alara of the Southern Isles. It was a perfect match on paper. Her family's shipping lanes would save Ethelgard's economy. But Julian knew the truth. He had found the encrypted emails on Silas's server 3 weeks ago. The marriage wasn't a union. It was a transfer of assets. Once the papers were signed, Julian would suffer another tragic accident, leaving Silas to rule as Alara's grieving advisor. Julian needed a nuclear option. He couldn't reject the marriage legally without causing a war. He needed Alara to reject him. He needed to be scandalized, ruined, unfit for the throne in the eyes of the conservative Southern Isles, but still beloved enough by his own people to survive the fallout. Enter the plan. Tonight was the winter solstice masquerade. Every dignitary from the continent was in the grand ballroom. Julian's plan was reckless, efficient, and self-destructive. He would be caught in a compromising position with Count Varick, a man known for his debauchery and lack of discretion. A public kiss, a staged stumble, a photographer tipped off in advance. It was suicide for his reputation, but it would save his life. The only variable Julian hadn't accounted for was Kalen Thorne. Kalen was a former underground pit fighter turned royal guard. He was 6'3" of quiet menace, with messy ink-black hair and eyes the color of oxidized copper, green, sharp, and usually devoid of emotion. Silas had hired him 2 years ago because Kalen was known to be a dog that obeyed only the hand that held the leash. Or so everyone thought. For 2 years, Kalen had stood 2 steps behind Julian. He had watched Julian endure the endless board meetings, the humiliating scolding from Silas, the loneliness that radiated off the prince like a chill. They rarely spoke outside of professional necessity. "Car is ready, Your Highness." "Watch your step, Your Highness." Threat assessment negative. But there was a tension that ran between them, a live wire buried under the floorboards. Julian often caught Kalen watching him in the reflection of windows, his gaze heavy and unreadable. Julian, in turn, found himself memorizing the way Kalen's muscles shifted under his suit, the lethal grace with which he moved. It was a fascination born of envy. Kalen was free in a way Julian would never be. Or perhaps, it wasn't envy at all. The night of the masquerade, the air in the palace was thick enough to choke on. The ballroom was a sea of silk, diamonds, and Venetian masks. The orchestra played a waltz that sounded like a funeral dirge to Julian's ears. Julian stood on the periphery, holding a glass of champagne he hadn't touched. He wore a mask of silver filigree that covered the upper half of his face, emphasizing the grim set of his mouth. Target sighted, he muttered to himself, though his earpiece was switched off. Across the room, Count Varric was holding court near the chocolate fountain. The man was greasy, loud, and perfect for a scandal. Julian took a deep breath, steeling himself. He had to do this. He had to walk over there, lure Varric to the balcony, and destroy his own future to survive. He adjusted his cuffs and took a step forward. A large, warm hand clamped onto his shoulder. "You're tense." Kalen's voice came from behind him. It wasn't a question. Julian flinched, turning to face his guard. Kalen was wearing a simple black domino mask, his jawline sharp and tense. He looked less like a guest, and more like a weapon sheathed in a tuxedo. "I'm fine, Kalen. Stay at your post." "My post is you," Kalen replied, his voice flat. "And you're sweating. Your heart rate is elevated. You're planning something." Julian narrowed his eyes behind the silver mask. "I am planning to enjoy my engagement party. Do not overstep." "You've been staring at Count Varric for 20 minutes, Kalen countered, stepping closer, invading Julian's personal space. The heat radiating off him was distracting. "Varric is a leech. If you go near him, he'll bleed you dry." "That is none of your concern," Julian hissed, lowering his voice. "I have orders for you. Go check the perimeter of the East Wing." Now, it was a dismissal, a command from a prince to a servant. Usually, Kalen would bow and obey. Instead, Kalen's eyes darkened. "No." Julian froze. "Excuse me. I said no. The East Wing is clear. My job is to protect you from threats. Right now, the biggest threat in this room seems to be whatever suicidal idea is running through your head." Panic flared in Julian's chest. He didn't have time for this. The photographer was in position. "You are relieved of duty for the next hour, Kalen." "That is an order." "Make me," Kalen challenged, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a shiver down Julian's spine. Julian turned on his heel, abandoning the argument. He couldn't let Kalen stop him. He marched toward Count Varric, forcing a charming smile onto his face. He intercepted the Count, exchanged a few flirty pleasantries, which tasted like bile in his mouth, and suggested they get some fresh air. Varric, predictable and lecherous, agreed instantly. They moved toward the French doors leading to the terrace, and from there, toward the secluded library entrance that Julian had unlocked earlier. It was perfect. Secluded enough for privacy, public enough to be caught. As they entered the dim library, the sounds of the party faded. "So, my prince," Varric leered, stepping closer, his breath smelling of brandy and cigars. "To what do I owe this private audience?" "Cold feet about the Lady Alara." "Something like that," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. He loathed this. He loathed that his freedom required him to sell his body, even for a moment, to a man like this. Varric reached out, his hand damp and clammy, touching Julian's waist. "Well, I'm always happy to help comfort royalty." Julian closed his eyes, bracing himself. Asterisk, just get it over with. Wait for the flash of the camera. Asterisk, the library door slammed open with a force that shook the floorboards. Varric jumped back. "What the?" Kalen stood in the doorway. He wasn't the composed bodyguard anymore. His mask was gone, discarded somewhere in his fury. His hair was disheveled, his chest heaving. And his eyes were murderous. "Get out," Kalen said. It wasn't a shout. It was a calm, absolute statement of fact. "Now see here," Varric began, puffing up his chest. Kalen moved. It was a blur of motion. One moment he was at the door, the next he had Varric by the throat, lifting the heavier man off the ground and slamming him against the doorframe. "I said," Kalen snarled, tightening his grip until Varric's face turned purple, "Get out, before I forget that I'm paid not to kill the guests." He released the Count, who gasped, scrambled for footing, and fled the room without a backward glance, the potential scandal forgotten in the face of primal fear. Silence descended on the library. Heavy, suffocating. Julian stood by the window, his hands shaking. His plan was ruined. The photographer had likely fled too. He was trapped. He was going to marry Alara, and Silas was going to kill him. "You idiot," Julian whispered, the despair cracking his voice. "You have no idea what you've done." Kalen turned slowly. The violence hadn't left his body yet. He stalked toward Julian, looking like a storm making landfall. I saved you from making a mistake, Kalen said. You didn't save me, Julian shouted, the mask of the composed prince finally shattering. He ripped the silver filigree from his face and threw it down. I needed that. I needed him to ruin me. It was the only way out. Kalen stopped, confusion warring with the anger on his face. What are you talking about? Silas, Julian choked out, backing away as Kalen advanced. The marriage. Once it's sealed, he's going to have me killed. I found the emails. I needed a scandal to void the contract. I needed to be found with a man. Anyone. It didn't matter who. Julian hit the bookshelf. He was cornered. Kalen stopped inches from him. The realization washed over the bodyguard's face, the anger draining away, replaced by something much more intense, much more complex. Horror at the threat to Julian's life, and a sudden, fierce possessiveness. So you were going to let that grease stain touch you? Kalen asked, his voice low. You were going to let him put his hands on you? Kiss you? I had to, Julian said, tears stinging his eyes. I'm desperate, Kalen. I'd kiss the devil himself if it meant surviving. Kalen stared at him. The silence stretched, charged with years of unsaid words, of glances and mirrors, of a devotion that went beyond a paycheck. Kalen stepped into Julian's space. He slammed his hand against the shelf, the sound that had started this scene. He pinned Julian there, using his body as a shield, a wall, a cage. You think you're disposable, Kalen muttered, his eyes dropping to Julian's lips, then back up to his eyes. You think your dignity is a currency you can just spend. It is, Julian whispered, mesmerized by the intensity in Kalen's gaze. I'm a prince. I am whatever the kingdom needs me to be. No, Kalen growled. He leaned in, his forehead resting against Julian's. You're Julian. And I haven't spent the last 2 years watching your back just to let you throw yourself away. Kalen's hand moved from the shelf to cup Julian's jaw. His thumb brushed over Julian's lower lip, a rough, possessive caress that made Julian's knees weak. You need a scandal? Kalen asked, his voice rough with emotion. You need a reason for the Southern Isles to run for the hills? You need to be caught with a man? Julian nodded breathlessly, unable to speak. Kalen's grip on his jaw tightened slightly, tilting Julian's head back. His eyes burned with a dark, terrifying promise. If you're gonna kiss a guy, Kalen breathed against his mouth, kiss me instead. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. A claiming. Before Julian could process the shift in their reality, Kalen closed the distance. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was an explosion. It was the taste of whiskey and suppressed rage. It was desperate and hungry, a collision of two souls who had been orbiting each other in the dark for too long. Julian gasped, his hands instinctively coming up to clutch at Kalen's lapels, pulling him closer. Kalen groaned, a low sound in his throat, and deepened the kiss, his tongue sweeping into Julian's mouth, claiming him utterly. For a moment, the politics, the assassination plots, the crumbling kingdom, it all vanished. There was only the heat of Kalen's body, the strength of his arms, the rough stubble grazing Julian's chin. It was terrifying. It was salvation. Julian realized, with a jolt of clarity, that he hadn't chosen Varric just because he was convenient. He had chosen a man because subconsciously, he had wanted this. He had wanted to break the rules that kept him from the one thing he actually desired. Kalen pulled back, just an inch, both of them panting for air. His lips were swollen, his eyes blown wide and dark. Let them come, Kalen whispered fiercely against Julian's skin. Let Silas come. Let the Southern Isles come. If you need a scandal, I'll give you a war. I will burn this whole palace down before I let anyone else touch you. Julian looked at him, really looked at him. He saw the scars on Kalen's neck, the fierce set of his jaw. He didn't see a servant. He saw a partner. They'll destroy us, Julian whispered, though the fear was rapidly being replaced by adrenaline. Let them try, Kalen replied. He kissed Julian again, softer this time, a seal on a pact written in treason. We go back out there. Together. We don't hide in the library. If you want to break the engagement, we do it my way. Your way? Kalen smirked, a dangerous, wolfish expression. Dominance. You don't get caught sneaking around like a ashamed child. You walk into that ballroom, you look Alara in the eye, and you leave with me. We make it clear that you aren't available. Not because you're loose, but because you're taken. It was insane. It was arrogant. It was exactly the kind of strength Julian had been starving for. Okay, Julian breathed. Okay. Kalen stepped back, smoothing Julian's lapels with a possessive swipe of his hands. He picked up Julian's silver mask from the floor and held it out. Ready to start a riot, Your Highness? Julian took the mask, but he didn't put it on. He looked at Kalen, his enemy turned bodyguard turned. Something else. Yes, Julian said, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in years. But Kalen, yeah. Don't ever pin me against a wall unless you plan to finish what you started. Kalen's grin was sharp enough to cut glass. Count on it. They walked out of the library and back toward the music, hand in hand, ready to set the world on fire. And that is how the prince found his sword, and the guard found his crown. If you enjoyed seeing Kalen take absolute control to save his prince, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments, would you risk an entire kingdom for one forbidden night? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then,